Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, was published in 1906. The circumstances that were revealed in this controversial book initiated the debate over food and drug manufacturing in the United States. Sinclair failed to generate reform for urban working conditions, which was his intent. However, the debate that followed The Jungle led to numerous successes and consequences regarding food safety in the United States. During the late 1800s, the United States was in dire need for reform. Industrialization transformed the country in the second half of the 19th century, from an agricultural-based society to an industrial culture. Cities began to grow throughout America, and immigration was at an all-time high. This resulted in an unprecedented need for urban labor. Unsafe and unfair working conditions became evident, along with other problems such as political corruption, widening gaps between social classes, and crowded cities. One highly debated issue was the regulation of food and drugs in America. Before the industrialization, the United States relied on agriculture as the main source of food. Due to the industrial transition, larger proportions of the populace became dependent upon the general market for food supplies. More and more food products were chemically engineered, and the mislabeling of manufactured foods increased dramatically. Simultaneously, there was a decrease in protection for consumers against unsanitary and harmful food and drugs. New chemical ingredients such as baking powder, glucose, and chemical preservatives allowed manufacturers to cheapen food products and mask food deterioration. Meat and milk were processed and sold under dirty conditions. Widespread abuses increased in food and agriculture processing, and many advertisements supported medicines that were little more than colored water and hardly relieved illnesses. Improved means of transportation, along with manufacturing and packaging advancements, allowed food products to be distributed over large areas. Due to these technological developments, the first federal law dealing with the regulation of food and drugs was enacted in America. Social and political leaders realized that reform was the only answer to America's troubles. By the early 1900s, the drive for social and economic reform began. This reform became known as the Progressive Movement. Most progressive leaders were native-born, middle or upper class, and college-educated. Social problems and the urban workplace were the main reforms, although many other issues were advocated. Reformers pushed the government to pass federal laws that required manufacturers to use pure ingredients in food products. One of the first public oppositions of impure foods was at the St. Louis Exposition of 1904. At the exhibit, groups displayed artificially colored foods. Then, they extracted the dye from the foods and continued to show how the same dyes could be used to color wool and silk fabric. Politicians, journalists, and consumers were all taken aback by this exhibit. In addition, the chief chemist in the Department of Agriculture, Dr. Harvey Wiley, tested food and patent medicines. He exposed foods being full of preservatives such as formaldehyde and additives, including wood particles. Little did the public know, one journalist's compelling novel was the only piece missing in passing a federal law for pure food and drugs. At the turn of the century, Chicago reigned in the meatpacking industry. Sinclair was sent to the meatpacking sector of Chicago to spend 7 weeks examining the lives of stockyard workers by editors of Appeal to Reason, a popular socialist magazine. His purpose was to advocate improving workers' rights in urban working conditions. He learned every detail about the workers' personal lives and the gruesome business practices of meatpacking industries. This research was the foundation of The Jungle, published in 1906. This bone-chilling novel depicted the unsanitary and horrific conditions at a meatpacking plant in Chicago. By publishing The Jungle, Sinclair hoped to illustrate the wretched circumstances within American industrial companies and inform citizens of the hidden truths of packaging plants. He described the sacrifices that employees had to go through while working. He wrote about them losing nails and fingers by working with acid, catching diseases, and even losing limbs. The use of chemicals such as borax and glycerin to disguise the smell was also a disturbing fact revealed in the novel. Sinclair hoped the public outcry would lead the way to multiple reforms. But Sinclair failed in advocating for working conditions. The workers' plight turned out not to be the biggest issue. The public was actually less appalled by the unsafe working conditions than by what they discovered about their food. News of impure food and the contents of packaged food thundered throughout the United States. Americans were disgusted and disgraced with corporate industries. Sinclair famously declared, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach." A food and drug bill, written by Department of Agriculture Chief Chemist Dr. Harvey Wiley, had been before Congress for many years. It had passed by the Senate twice, yet the House rejected the proposition each time, even though it was supported by the American Medical Association and numerous magazines. Even President Roosevelt believed that the bill should be passed in order to ensure safe food products for American citizens. Without realizing it, Sinclair had written the key to passing the federal law. His novel substantiated these efforts by providing primary evidence of the ills of manufacturing plants. Roosevelt had ordered an investigation previous to the publication of The Jungle, yet nothing was reported. After reading the book, he responded to public pressures. He promised Sinclair's accusations would be considered when he wrote, "The specific evils you point out shall, if their existence be proved, and if I have power, be eradicated." He instructed Secretary of Agriculture James Wilson to look into the meatpacking houses issue a second time. A report by Commissioner Charles Neal and social worker J.B. Reynolds backed Sinclair's accusations. The results were astounding. Meat shoveled from filthy wooden floors, rarely washed, and pushed from room to room in rotten boxcars. Roosevelt threatened to publish the entire report if Congress did not pass the Food and Drug Act. However, the legislation was still debated. Congress was not pleased with the bill because it interfered with freedom of businesses. Also, meatpackers heartily resented the proposal. J. Ogden Armour, the president of major meatpacking business Armour & Company, argued, "Meat and food products, generally speaking, are handled as carefully and circumspectly as they are in the average home kitchen." Thomas Wilson of Nelson Moore's Company described his processing plant as clean as any kitchen. Also, the National Wholesale Liquors Association lobbied hard against the legislation and even threatened to boycott several progressive newspapers. The Franco-American Food Company also denied the report in an open letter to President Roosevelt and the American nation. It stated, "For 20 years we have manufactured canned soups and canned meats of the highest grade, both as to quality and purity. We have spared neither effort or expense to make them as good as possible." When Congress stalled, Roosevelt published the first part of the Neal Reynolds report. Suddenly, all opposition collapsed. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act finally became federal laws in 1906. Although Upton Sinclair failed to achieve his original goal, his book served a much larger purpose. The two acts would not have been passed without the substantiation of The Jungle. Consequently, new and strict guidelines were placed on companies to ensure safe preparations of food and drugs. The act authorized inspectors to examine food-related manufacturers and restaurants. Milk had to be pasteurized and water had to be chlorinated. Also, federal inspection of all meat sold, accurate labeling, and dating of canned meat were all mandatory under the act. Most importantly, the law made it a federal crime to sell adulterated food or drugs. One major consequence of the Pure Food and Drug Act was the creation of the Food and Drug Administration in 1927, previously known as the Bureau of Chemistry. The United States Department of Agriculture, placed in charge of enforcing the law, has grown into an important federal bureau that contains 17 agencies. New laws were needed as America progressed in technology, and in 1938, the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act was passed. Although it was eventually outdated, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 led the way for future legislation to be passed regarding consumer safety, such as the 1990 Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, which requires all packaged food to contain nutrition information and serving sizes. Today, the Food and Drug Administration works to promote and protect American consumers. Upton Sinclair's investigations contributed to an ongoing debate over the regulation of food and drugs. Without the publication of The Jungle and his relentless efforts, the hidden reality of the corrupt meatpacking industry may never have been exposed.